Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Wire, which is not the TV show, but the episode, which is episode number 22 of Season 2 of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Star Trek as determined by my Patreon user polls. The episode to win my latest Patreon poll, well, my latest Patreon poll was actually a tie between this episode, The Wire, and the original series episode, The Changeling, which both episodes I love and I would be happy to review either one. However, I just watched The Changeling for my Season 2 original series review, and I'm kind of original series out a little bit. I'm kind of sick of talking about the original series, so I decided to review The Wire. So The Wire is the episode in which Garak gets ill because he has a device that's in his implant in his head that he has had turned on for the past couple of years that is meant to give him pleasure when he's getting tortured so that he does not give away vital information. But because living on Deep Space Nine in exile is kind of torture to him, he had it on the whole time and is not meant for long-term use, so it breaks down. And so Garak starts to go a bit insane as Bashir tries to save his life, and Garak gives several different versions of why he was exiled. None of them really add up, and Bashir eventually goes to the former head of the Obsidian Order, who is heavily implied is the one who exiled Garak, Enabran Tain, who gives Bashir the information he needs to save Garak's life, because in his words, a quick death is too good for Garak, and he wants him to live a long, torturous life surrounded by people who hate him. So, there's a tricky thing about this episode. There's something that several people have noted before, is that this episode is kind of a fan favorite, and it's kind of really well liked, but it's kind of light in retrospect. And this is something we sort of noted for people who haven't seen Deep Space Nine before, who aren't familiar with the character of Garak, who watch the show in order, don't really care for this episode. It's only people who've actually seen the whole show and know Garak already, know the character, that actually love this episode. And I find that to actually be true with myself, because when this episode first aired, I wasn't really that into it. I was like, it's another forgettable episode focusing on some side character who's barely appeared, so what do I really care about? But then, of course, when I go back and years later, when I watch the entirety of DS9 and I go back and watch this episode, I was like, oh, this is an amazing Garak episode where the whole thing started. Now, I've heard other YouTubers describe this as a negative thing and sort of saying, well, you can't really say it's that great of an episode then if that's the case. And I beg to differ. I would have to disagree. I actually think the fact that is the case doesn't hurt this episode. I still think it's a great episode. I just think that it's maybe a little ahead of its time, and me as an audience member, other audiences who didn't really like this episode when it first came out, or if they watched the show in order when they first saw it, didn't like it as much until later on. It's kind of our fault, I think, for not appreciating, because I'm sure there's some people out there who liked this episode from the very beginning. Because I feel like, just speaking for myself personally, that I brought my own bias towards it. I was like, oh, this is a side character who I don't really care about. And I think that was the main perspective that prevented me from liking this episode. It's not, so once Garak was became my favorite character, and there's a lot of people, he's a fan favorite. He's a lot of people's favorite character on the show, and he became my favorite character on Deep Space Nine later on. Then I watched the show and I was like, oh, this is a great Garak episode. Rather, oh, this is some episode focused on some nothing character I don't care about. And I think that's my fault. That's my mindset, that I think some people maybe did come into this episode and loved it from the start because they came in with the correct mindset of this is an interesting character, not is this a supporting character or main character or side character. It's more of just judge the episode on its own. So that's why I think this is still a great episode, and that certain people who don't like it before they are familiar with Garak, I think that's their own fault. Because I think people who actually judge the episode on its own merits without letting, extraneous information such as who's the supporting character and who's the side character interfere with their enjoyment with this episode would appreciate the episode for being objectively good. So I think that this episode is objectively good. And so I think people are actually correct, even though maybe it takes them a while to have to get familiar with Garak first before they appreciate this episode. I don't think that diminishes the episode. I think that speaks more of the viewer who didn't like it at the beginning, and I include myself in this, than it does on the episode itself. Personally, because I think, objectively speaking, this is a really great Garak episode. In fact, I don't know if it was this episode definitely got me to stand up and notice Garak, but I didn't instantly become a Garak fan, but I was definitely looked on him more favorably, not just some side nothing character. And I think it was more of in season 3 where he appeared in episodes like The Search and I want to call Face of the Enemy, but that's a TNG episode. It's another one where Kira is Cardassian. I've been brain farting on episode titles lately, so you have to forgive me. But the one in season 3 where they try to convince Major Kira that she was a Cardassian the whole time. Garak played an important role in that. So it's episodes like that slowly use Garak in amazing ways. And then I think, of course, the two-parter, starting with Improbable Calls and then the Dias Cast, that's what solidified to myself, and I'm sure many others, Garak as a really amazing character, as one of the best, if not the best, character of Deep Space Nine. So it did take that slowly building, and, you could say that this episode maybe should have eased more into Garak instead of just jumping straight in like it did and say it's the episode's fault in that regard. But I would disagree with that. Now, as for the episode itself, the camaraderie between Garak and Bashir really came off, because this is mainly what we knew from the character of Garak, because he only appeared in one episode of season 1, and it was all about him introducing himself to Bashir. And then we saw earlier in season 2, the episode Cardassians, that they had developed this sort of casual friendship where they'd eat lunch together all the time and have philosophical discussions, and Garak even involved Bashir in this plot to discredit Goldcott or whatever during that episode, and so they end up having some sort of working relationship as well. And I think this episode illustrates that very well. And I love how it's very interesting, because at first, they're, having their chatty conversation as they normally do while they're waiting in line for lunch. Now, why there would be a line at a Replimat, which seriously is just like a replicator, you just go up and say, I want this. Why they would have to wait in a huge line for that is beyond me, but let's not get bogged down in that detail. Anyway, while they were waiting in line, Garak starts to get irritable, and he's very obviously in pain, and Bashir tries to take him to the infirmary, but Garak, of course, immediately rejects that. And then you get a nice scene when we come back from the opening credits where Bashir is helping Jadzia out with a plant that's dying, and he mentions Garak, and Jadzia's like, oh yeah, but it doesn't really matter because you two aren't, it's not like you're friends. And he's like, yeah, exactly, I'm not friends, so if he wants to be stubborn and kill himself, I don't care. And he shoots it up and storms out. So obviously, I love that scene because it's portraying that obviously he does care about Garak, and he may try to deny that he's friends with Garak, and this is actually nicely booked in by the end of the episode when he meets up with Enabran and Tain. Enabran and Tain asks if they're friends, and Bashir says, yes, I am his friend. So and that's of course something that he would learn to admit to himself throughout the course of the episode, which I think was actually really well earned. And of course, at this beginning part, he was in denial about it. And then we had this amazing scene where Garak was getting drunk at Quark's bar because Garak was trying to find a replacement for this torture device, but then it was so classified that Quark, even mentioning it to his Cardassian contact, likely got that Cardassian arrested or possibly killed, which that was in a very intense scene. But anyway, so Garak has lost all hope of ever getting a replacement or fixing that implant, so he's kind of resigned himself that he's screwed, and so he's just trying to do anything to dull the pain. So of course, what do you try to do to dull the pain? You get pissed drunk. And he even says, and he's obviously drunk off his ass, and I love this scene. I love every time Star Trek does someone getting drunk, and Andrew Robinson, of course, does a great job at portraying drunk, but it doesn't actually dull the pain, because he even says, in a very drunkenly manner, it's like, anyone who talks about the dulling effect of your liquor is severely overstating the matter, when clearly he's drunk off his ass, but it's still not helping. And then of course Bashir, Quark calls Bashir to try to help Garak, and Bashir tries to let's go drink somewhere quiet. No, by the way, I'm going to stop by the infirmary on the way. Is that alright? And Garak's just like, what kind of fool do you think I am? I love that. Because, of course, Garak, he may be drunk off his ass, but he's no idiot. He can still, it's kind of obvious what they're trying to do, and he is kind of treating him like a fool. I think he was hoping that he's too drunk to notice, but he's not. But then, of course, Garak collapses, and so Bashir has to look after him. And I love this. It's like we get a nice montage of Bashir looking after Garak. Garak is suffering and going, and you see that Bashir is sleeping on a chair and looking after him, and you get the musical montage that shows that he really does care about what happens to Garak. It's not just another patient. And I loved that. I thought that was great. Now, I guess we got to talk about, I think it might be my least favorite aspect of the episode, is the 3 different stories that Garak gives as to why he was exiled. Because previous episodes, they didn't outright state he was exiled, but they heavily implied it. In fact, some of the previous episode played at that he was actually a spy still in contact with Cardassians and can speak for them. Like the first episode he appeared in, Past Prologue. I remember that one. Anyway, but they kind of abandoned that idea by the time we got to this episode, and it was very clear that he was in fact exiled. And so at this stage, this is so early, as I said, very early in this character's appearance. The main thing that the audience is wondering is why he was exiled. And this episode doesn't answer that. It kind of teases at that. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that it wasn't fully answered, because I think whatever full answer that we got would not really be that satisfying. So it gives us 3 possible scenarios, and we can kind of guess that there's truths in each of the different scenarios. But each of the different scenarios involves a co-worker or best friend named Elam. And of course, anyone watching who's seen Deep Space Nine knows that Elam is Garak's first name, and I love how that's the twist of this episode, that's what Enabran Tain reveals to Bashir, and because Bashir asks about Elam, and he's like, Elam, that's his first name. And of course, going forward, they use his first name. We know him as Elam Garak, so it kind of, and looking back in this, watching this episode in retrospect, it's like a deer, but we didn't know that at the time. That wasn't revealed. And it's funny that no one in the station even know, or at least Bashir didn't know his first name. You'd think that would be in his patient files, but whatever. Maybe he just never gave that information to Starfleet when he had to live on the station. Anyway, But yeah, so we get 3 different versions of the story, and the first one was kind of like, oh, he shot down a freighter to kill Bajorn terrorists, but it turns out there was a high-ranking politician on board. And the second version is that he actually let these Bajorn children go because he was tired and he was sure that they had nothing to do with anything. But Elam saw this and was shocked, and he got exiled for being lacking his duty. And then the third version was that there was just some conspiracy with someone letting some terrorists go, and he did everything he possibly could to frame his best friend Elam, but Elam had beat him to it and framed him instead. I think, I like this kind of leaving it up to the audience's mindset, because you could probably draw certain information from each of the 3 different stories. And of course you get the very classic line, one of my favorite Garak lines at the end of the episode, where Bashir confronts Garak once he's feeling better, and is like, well, which of these stories are true and which ones are lies? And he's like, well, they're all true. And then Bashir asks, even the lies? And then Garak says, especially the lies. Now, of course, that doesn't actually make any sense, but it sounds cool. And you can kind of infer what he means by that. Sort of, but to me, that kind of defines character and the type of Garak, and the type of character that he is. And I do think that strung together there are truths in that. Now, I think I must mention that there was a novel that was co-written by Andrew Robinson, the actor who plays Garak, that came out after Deep Space Nine finished, that did come up with a definitive story on how Garak, it was like basically a biography that told Garak's life story, and they did come up with the reason on why exactly he was exiled. And I reject that. I thought it sucked. Because it involved like a love interest, which I wasn't a fan of that whole storyline. I don't think Garak needed a love interest. So I reject that as the actual reason of why he was exiled. And I actually think it's better that we do not know why he was exiled. So let's talk about the never-ending sacrifice. I actually really like this. So this, of course, is the Cardassian classic novel that Garak lends Bashir to read, and he finds it boring. Now, and Garak is appalled. How dare you? Now, I actually love this. I love this touch because usually whenever they talk about literature, they talk about stuff that we know. They talk about Shakespeare. They talk about Jules Verne. They talk about mainly Shakespeare, but they talk about novels from our, not there, but our past. And I get tired of that. I'm like, don't these aliens have like their own literature? And so it's actually interesting that they actually were talking about a classic novel from a fictitious alien race. And it makes so much sense, like, that it fits within the Cardassian culture because it's because they are a fascist totalitarian society, and so that they would prize the literature, the novel that they would prize most of all would be a story that tells several stories throughout several generations of the same family, and they basically all do the same thing. They live and die for the state, in service of the state, and that's it. And I gotta side with Julian here. This sounds incredibly boring, and no, but it is interesting hearing Garak saying, "Oh, the repetitive narrative form is one of Cardassian's literature's best forms because it really sells the whole point is that they all live for the state because that's all that matters." That actually reminds me of classic literature that I think sucks, like Jane Austen, for example, where people on other things, like even some Shakespeare stuff, who like, no, you don't understand, it illustrates the classic need for the blah blah blah, and I'm like, yeah, but it's boring. Anyway, let's talk about Enabran and Tain. I absolutely, positively love the scene where Bashir goes to visit Enabran and Tain to try to get the information he needs to save Garak's life. The scene it was just so good from start to finish. Because I love how they slowly intimate that even though Enabran Tain, like he's supposed to be the spy master, you know, the one who mentored Garak, and although he's retired, but I love how the scene slowly disseminates that he still like knows everything. He literally knows what you had for breakfast. Because I love when Bashir shows up and he's like, "Oh, I hope you weren't treated too rudely at the Cardassian border." And Bashir's like, "Well, not as rudely as I thought I would be." And he's like, "Oh, good, because I warned them you were coming." And it's very clear that Bashir did not announce he was coming. He did not tell Enabran Tain was coming, that he just figured it out on his own, like he knew he was coming. And my favorite part is when Enabran Tain offers him something to drink, and it's like, "Oh, would you like something to drink? Tarkalian tea, perhaps?" And I love Bashir's reaction. Bashir's reaction is like, "Oh, I always drink Tarkalian tea." Like, that's brilliant. I absolutely love that, because it shows, like, his first initial reaction was like, "Hey, I like that drink too," but then, like, a light bulb, like, went off in his head, and he finally started to click, like, "Wait a second, how the fuck does he know what I drink?" And this is scary. This guy knows way more about me than he should. And I love, like, Enabran Tain's, like, humble response. "Oh, a good host should always know the needs of his guests." So I love his, like, he's very Garak-like, so it makes all the sense in the world that this is the guy who mentored and trained Garak. Because they're both very good at, like, saying, I think Odo said it best when he said they say a lot and they actually tell you very little. They're not actually, they talk a lot, but they say little. I think that's what he said. Because he just likes to present this false facade, this sense of being a veneer of being like friendly, but really they're like insidious. and I think Enabran Tain is more insidious than Garak, and of course he's supposed to be more of a master at it than Garak. And so I love the interactions between them. And I do love that Bashir was starting to pick up that the conversation was meaning different things, like when Enabran Tain was like, "Oh, I'm sure I could learn a lot from you," and he's like, "Oh, well, I'll tell you anything you want to know about medical, about this new medical thing, or tennis. I can tell you about this new racket they came out with." And he's like, "No, that's okay." Bashir is it's kind of twisting that way. It's like, "Yeah, I'm not going to tell you shit." Which in a very clever way, and I like that. I did appreciate that. But then, of course, Bashir was just asking, "Hey, I needed some information to save Garak's life," and he was surprised. And Enabran Tain was like, "Sure, I'll help you do it." And he was like, "Oh, thank you." And Enabran Tain was like, "Oh, don't thank me. I'm doing this because a quick death is too good for Garak, and I want him to live the rest of his life being tortured and living with people, surrounded by people who hate him, and never knowing that he'll never ever be able to come home." And I love Bashir is like, "What a lovely sentiment," and his only response is, "Oh, it's from the heart, I assure you." Which is, oh my god, I just love this scene so much. It's just so damn good. Now, Enabran Tain apparently was originally meant to be a one-off character. This was supposed to be his only appearance, but fans loved him so much, and the producers thought the actor did such a great job, which he did, that they brought him back. Now, I wasn't too pleased with the revelation that he was Garak's father. I think that kind of soils the relationship a bit. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but that's a totally different episode. But I did think it made all the sense in the world that they brought this character back several times, because he was so good. It would be a waste for him to just be in this one scene. Anyway, my rating for The Wire out of 10, I'm going to give this a 9. Excellent. I think it's an absolutely excellent episode. It's very smartly written, like the dialogue between Bashir and Garak, and of course the Enabran Tain scene. It's just a smartly written episode that has a nice progression. Seeing Garak describing, like actually showing the friendship between Bashir and Garak actually means something, and seeing Garak like go crazy and act drunk and like be manic, basically going up and down, and he has like different stories of his past depending on what kind of mood he was in. Well, meanwhile Bashir was just concerned with saving his life. Yeah, it's just great acting, great dialogue, very well written. I think it's not just in retrospect because I like Garak now. I think this episode is objectively amazing, and maybe some people who aren't familiar with Garak just can't see that. Anyway, that's it for my review of The Wire. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks of course for all those who support me on Patreon. I very much appreciate it. If you would like to support me on Patreon, I appreciate it very much. You get early releases to videos like this one 2 months before it hits my channel, as well as pre-releases for other videos and other sort of goodies like my schedule. And if you donate $10 or more, you can request a video for me to do, and I shall do it. So if you can support me on Patreon, very much appreciated. If not, of course, subscribe, leave a like, also very much appreciated. So be sure to check out my channel for more Star Trek videos and videos on many other shows like Star Wars: The Clone Wars, Star Trek, the original series, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.